Hello, welcome to the program. Ahead, top ad exec and Gruen transfer TV star Russell Howcroft joins 10 as the network's ratings slump drags on. We'll look at the first half ad revenue numbers from Caesar as online overtakes newspapers for the first time. But is this telling the real story? And looking after Kim, the Kardashian circus in town as the channel that made her famous gets a bit of a facelift. But first, to the latest in Nine Entertainment's debt refinancing talks. The company's owner, CVC Asia Pacific, has lost its managing partner, Adrian McKenzie, who's resigned as the private equity firm looks set to lose big on its investment. Well, let's get some more analysis on what his resignation means and whether Nine could actually go into receivership. We have with us, as always, our co-host James Manning, the editor and publisher of Mediaweek. And we're also joined today by the AFR Deputy Editor Business, James Chessell from our Sydney CBD studio. Great to see you both. And James Chessell, if we could start with you. I mean, firstly on the resignation of Adrian McKenzie there. I mean, what's that signalling to you about CVC's intentions with its Nine holding?
Well, I think every time I'm here we end up talking about Nine, but it's a pretty significant day when CVC's managing partner, Adrian McKenzie, resigns from the private equity firm. He's been there for 17 years, 11 years in Australia, and it's a pretty significant moment for the reason that CVC is basically admitting they've done their dough. So they invested about $1.9 billion into Nine back in 2006. And this resignation is telling you that that $1.9 billion is probably worthless now. And it'll be left between Nine's lenders on one side and Goldman Sachs, which is another type of lender, on the other side to fight over what remains and what they can get out of the some sort of restructure of Nine's balance sheet and its financial structure.
Now, James, Debt 101 explained to us about this. There was going to be a February deadline that they had to have all this sort of finance restructured. Why is there sort of a crisis now?
Well, as you know, James, it's a complicated and multi-layered thing, but it's pretty simple when you think about it. CVC bought Nine back in 2006 for about $5.6 billion. $5.6 billion. These days it's worth about half that much, so there's a massive gap that needs to be closed. So even if they sold the business tomorrow, they're probably out of pocket about two and a bit billion dollars. In October, there is a covenant to do with this debt. It's very technical, but all you need to know basically is this covenant will be breached, and that basically acts as a trigger for all the various parties that have their tentacles into Nine to get together and have to talk about things, because that could prove to be a trigger that could potentially put the company into receivership if one of the various parties or indeed management were uncomfortable about the way things were going.
What do you know of the talks then this week? And I mean, how close do you think that the likelihood of receivership is?
I think it's a 50-50 bet, to be honest, so it's pretty serious. What we do know is that Nine Chief Executive David Gyngell will be holding a meeting with all the lenders early next week, Monday or Tuesday probably. We have to get through the Jewish holidays. And once he does that, he'll explain to the lenders what would happen to the business if it was put into receivership. Presumably that's not a very good story. The lenders who haven't really seen eye to eye on the future of Nine will go away, consider their options, and you know, I think an objective observer would hope that they would come to some sort of compromise that would see the business not go into receivership, because it's not an ideal thing for any business, particularly a media business with a lot of moving parts, a brand that's very public, to an experience it should go through.
James, many people think the Nine Entertainment Co business has probably been managed pretty well in the last couple of years, maybe as good as they could. So what went wrong? Does CVC say they bought at the top of the market and then the ad decline? Is there more to it than that? Yeah,
I mean, that's the irony, James. I think there's actually a very well-run, reasonably profitable business in Nine. It's just that its balance sheet and the amount of debt, I mean, we endlessly use this cliche debt mountain, but that is what is weighing down on this business. So most observers would say that David Gyngell's done as good a job as possible running it. The ratings are pretty strong. Demographically, they're beating 7 this year. They're certainly well ahead of 10, which is struggling, as we all know. But because of the decision that was made back in 2006, when there was a lot of cheap and easily available debt around, they're still paying the penalties for that, you know, six years later.
And tell me, if they did go into a receivership, what would that actually mean for the business? Are we going to see anything different?
That's a good question, and that's something we're probably going to have to wait till Monday or Tuesday to hear, to get into the fine detail. But, one example, Nine owns to the ticketing business, which, has obviously a very important relationship with all the credit card providers, and that's going to be a bit more complicated for them, for example, if they want to be dealing with a business that's been put into the hands of receivers. I mean, it's also important to note that there are television businesses such as Seven that have been put into receivership many years ago, and they came out of it and they survived and they've flourished. So there's no way that it'll be the end of the Nine television licence and the Nine network or anything like that, but it will make it more difficult for management to run the business. And then, over the top of that, you have a layer of lawyers and accountants that get involved that probably slow down the whole process, and it's a complicated and messy process that everyone would probably like to avoid if possible.
You explained it so well, James. I just wanted to ask as well, I mean, we were talking earlier there about Adrian Mackenzie's resignation from CVC Asia Pacific. I just wanted to ask you too then about David Gyngell and, the fact that he seems to be handling the pressure well from all accounts. I mean, what do you think? I mean, is he expected to stay in there for the long term?
I mean, I think that's a good question. If the business went into receivership, there'd be a question mark over his tenure there, but I think all indications are if the various parties that own Nine's debt can come to some sort of compromise, you would expect David Gyngell to stay around for several years. There's no indication that he's looking to leave the business in the short term.
And if David Gyngell we can't point the finger at him for what's going on there now, what's happening at 10, if we sort of segue over there. James Warburton, is he clean of any responsibility yet about their poor year?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the other thing, James, we always end up talking about as well. I've said to you before, I think a new CEO probably deserves a year before you can make a definitive conclusion about what they've done. I think there are some things that James probably hasn't handled as well as he would have liked. The appointment of Mike Morrison in that sales job, who he's now left, probably hasn't worked out well. But on the other hand, we're talking about a large corporation, and he inherited some pretty serious problems, not just from the previous CEO, Lachlan Murdoch, but from the CEO before that, Grant Blackley. And that's going to take a while to flow through. So I'm not trying to sit on the fence, but I think you've probably got to give him 12 months before you can say that. One interesting thing, and if we're drawing a parallel to Nine, people within Nine talk about it took 5 years for that business, the brand of that business, to fully recover from those sort of dark days when David Gyngell left the first time and Eddie Maguire took over. And if you look now on Twitter and you look in the media, Ten's problems have probably moved out of the financial pages and into more mainstream kind of consciousness. And so I think you're looking at another situation where Ten's probably got several years of recovery that's going to have to go through, and it's worth pointing out as well that Ten's in a lot worse position than Nine was back in 2005.
James Manning, can I just ask you too, because we've seen as well this week the appointment of Russell Howcroft, very well known, as a TV star, but also as a top ad man as well. He's been appointed senior executive role at 10. What can he bring, and can this help?
I'm not sure really. It's a weird role. It's management. It's not really in sales. He's got strong advertising background, but it's more on the creative side. The talk yesterday, people were saying, look, 10 have employed someone else without a background in television, so I'm not sure. And the other thing is he doesn't start till February next year. So I guess that's one thing we have to keep in mind. It's a relatively long-term proposition that James Warburton's looking at, so he's not going to have his firepower until next year. I'd be interested in, James Chessel, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's a gutsy choice, James. I agree with you. We talked about Mike Morrison before, and James Warburton himself came from a media buying background. He's brought in to Seven by David Leckie. He was a bit of an odd choice, or an unexpected choice in a way, and he seems to be trying to replicate that. So it's a high-risk approach, but people speak highly of Russell. They think he's quite talented, and maybe you do need, at a network that is doing as badly as 10 is, you need something different. You need some fresh thinking. So, I think it's a high risk but potentially high reward decision.
I just want to ask you too, because I mean, you know, we're hearing 10 talking about bringing out new US programming next month to try and lift its share, but it's got to be hurting the discussions over 2013 ad rate deals, right?
Oh, without a doubt. I think those US shows that they've fast-tracked, as we like to say, will probably be worth 1 or 2 share points, which will be much needed for 10, and it'll get them back above the ABC probably. But they're going to have a tough time when they're talking to advertisers at the end of this year. There's no doubt about it. I think you're looking at 10 ending this calendar year at about 24% of the metropolitan ad market, which is pretty disappointing.
Yeah, some people have been predicting, look, it might even slip as low as 20 or just under. The advertisers obviously want to keep 10 as an important player, but I guess they've got to, they're responsible to their clients as well, and their clients are going to be asking questions if they're tipping them into all these 10 shows for next year.
Yeah, absolutely. I think 20 is a bit an extreme prediction, but you know, I think 24 or maybe even slightly lower is pretty realistic, and also, you know, not a great result.
Just very quickly as well, James Chessell, sector sentiment, and we've seen online staying strong, big falls in magazines though. Does structural change make this cycle a lot harder to predict?
Yeah, there's a lot of happy topics today, aren't there?
Sorry.
The SMI numbers, I think, you mentioned Caesar before, but the SMI numbers that were out earlier this week were diabolical. Free-to-air television, and which SMI measures the best, was down 13%, and even if there's a margin of error of you know 1 or 2 percentage points in that, it's a really bad number. And if you're looking at the way these companies budget their second year, they're hoping it's going to be flat. So Nine, for example, their earnings forecasts are based on the assumption that the second half of the year, this year, is going to be flat. It doesn't look like that's going to be the case, and you know, we've seen redundancies today at 7 West Media, at the newspaper division over in Perth. It's just a really tough time, and there is absolutely, don't believe anything anyone says to you. There is no reason to think that things are going to get better. There's no indication that that's the case. So I think it's going to be a pretty miserable time in the lead up to Christmas.
And on that happy note, James, we'll say goodbye and thank you so much for joining us today on the show.
Cheers.
James Chessell there from the AFR. Well, look, just staying at with the ad market and those Caesar numbers that we mentioned earlier, James, let's just have a look through them. These are the first half numbers for 2012, and comparing them to the first half of 2011.
We talk about Caesar and SMI. The Caesar figures look at the whole market, so that's ad agency plus direct, whereas the SMI numbers are very accurate, but they just focus on the agency, which is, you know, a majority of the sales to most of the major media.
I mean, James saying there, look, you know, it's not going to get better anytime soon, but certainly when you looked at the numbers, the overall ad decline, it wasn't too bad, down 0.4%.
Yeah, historically too. We spoke to Bernard Holt from Caesar this week. He's been collating this stuff since 1960. In historical terms, it's not a massive fall. There's been some other bigger ones. You know, last decade or the decade before, a couple of bigger percentage drops, and the market did bounce back. I guess the thing underlying all this is the structural change we've talked about so much on this program that will make the recovery a little bit harder to pick and predict.
We were just looking before there at the, I guess, all the sectors that did very well, and of course online leading the way there. I mean, that's been predicted, but overtaking newspapers for the first time and closing in on free-to-air TV. What do you think? I mean, we've talked about this a lot, but does it really tell the full story? Because certainly the newspaper works was saying that it doesn't.
Yeah, no, because you know, newspapers are contributing a lot to that growth in digital. A lot of the business they're writing is getting counted in there. So I think we might see some of that being broken out in the future when newspapers say, look, some of this business is sort of ours, because we are going through that structural change.
I guess amongst those fallers, I mean, we saw newspapers down about 11%, but magazines was really, I guess, the key headline out of the Caesar numbers as well, and we're seeing the falls on the graphic there of about 26% for that sector.
Yeah, that's that 6 month. Year on year, I think the fall's about 11%, so it's not quite as bad, but yeah, magazines have had a shocker for sure.
And just as well, just breaking down the free-to-air TV numbers, while the Metropolitan was down, Regional actually didn't do too badly.
Regional managed to edge it up a little bit. Yeah, they pretty much held their own, so it was a better story for them.
All right, James, plenty more to ask you about coming up after this very short break. Then on Mediaweek, we're going to be looking at Kim Kardashian's flying visit to Australia to promote a new look for the channel that made her famous.